The trucks arrived just after sunrise. For weeks, the women had been told the same thing. The Americans were ruthless, cruel, hungry for revenge. So, when the gates opened and U.S. soldiers stepped inside the temporary holding camp, no one moved. The women stood in silence. Most of them were barely in their 20s. Some had served as communication staff, others as nurses. A few had been attached to supply units. Now they were simply prisoners, exhausted, confused, and unsure of what would happen next. One of the American guards called out something in English. No one responded. Then a second soldier stepped forward, this time speaking broken German. "Breakfast," he said. "For you." That word didn't make sense. Breakfast? The women looked at each other. Suspicion spread instantly. Food had been scarce for months. Back home, even civilians had been rationing crumbs. Many of these women had survived on thin soup and black bread. And now the enemy was offering breakfast? It had to be a joke. Or worse, humiliation. Two soldiers began unloading large metal containers from the back of a truck. Steam rose into the cold morning air. The smell drifted across the yard. It stopped the whispers immediately. Eggs. Real eggs. Then another smell. Bacon. Someone near the fence covered her mouth. "That's impossible," she whispered. The guards began setting up folding tables, plates, mugs, white bread. One of the women stepped back, shaking her head. "They want us to beg," she muttered. But no one was laughing. The Americans weren't shouting. They weren't mocking. They weren't filming. They were just serving. An older woman near the front finally spoke. "If it's poisoned," she said quietly, "then we'll all know together." No one moved, until one of the youngest prisoners, barely 18, took a single step forward, and everything changed. No one ordered them to sit. No one forced them forward. The Americans simply stepped back. That confused them more than anything. One of the guards, a young soldier who couldn't have been older than 20, gestured toward the tables. "You eat," he said slowly, in broken German. The youngest prisoner, the same girl who had stepped forward earlier, walked toward the table as if approaching something dangerous. Every eye followed her. She stared at the plate. 2 eggs, several strips of bacon, white bread, a small square of butter, and something she hadn't seen in months, real coffee. Her hands trembled. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she looked at the soldiers, searching their faces for mockery, for a trap, for cruelty. There was none. Just tired men, watching quietly. She finally lowered herself onto the bench. The wood creaked. The sound felt louder than gunfire. No one spoke. She picked up the fork, paused, then cut a small piece of egg. For a moment, she simply stared at it, as if it might disappear. Then she placed it in her mouth. Silence. Her eyes widened. She didn't chew at first. It was warm, soft, real, not powdered, not rationed, not stretched with substitutes. She swallowed. And then something unexpected happened. She began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just silent tears running down a dirty face. Across the yard, another woman whispered, "Is it good?" The girl nodded. That was all it took. Chairs scraped, boots shuffled. Within seconds, dozens of women were seated, still cautious, still unsure, but eating. One of them laughed suddenly. A broken, almost disbelieving sound. "They told us the Americans would starve us." Another shook her head. "They said we would beg for scraps." Instead, plates were being refilled. No shouting, no humiliation, just food. One of the older women, a former field nurse, looked down at her hands as she buttered the bread. "They lied to us," she said quietly. No one argued. Across the yard, one American soldier turned slightly away. He didn't want them to see that he was also wiping his eyes, because in that moment, something shifted. Not politically, not militarily, humanly. The war was still burning across Europe, but here, in a muddy campyard at dawn, propaganda collapsed over a plate of eggs, and none of them would ever forget it. The yard felt different now. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The tension hadn't disappeared. It had changed shape. The women were no longer afraid of the food. They were afraid of what it meant. Most of them ate slowly, not because they wanted to make it last, but because each bite felt like a betrayal of something they had believed for years. One woman stared at her plate long after she had finished. "They said we would be punished," she murmured. Another replied quietly, "Maybe this is the punishment." That thought lingered. because kindness was harder to process than cruelty. Cruelty confirmed what they had been told. Kindness shattered it. Across the table, a former radio operator folded her hands together. "If they lied about this," she whispered, "what else did they lie about?" No one answered. In the distance, more trucks arrived, not with weapons, with blankets, medical supplies, fresh water containers. An American medic knelt beside one of the older prisoners who had been coughing earlier. He spoke gently, checking her pulse, offering something from his bag. She looked confused, not suspicious anymore, just confused. One of the younger women leaned closer to her friend. "My brother is still fighting," she said quietly. "He believes they will destroy everything." Her friend looked toward the American soldiers. "They could have treated us differently," she said. There had been bombings, losses, families shattered on both sides, yet here they were, being served coffee. A small thing, but it felt enormous. One prisoner suddenly covered her face with both hands. "I don't know what to think anymore." That sentence spread silently across the yard, because if the enemy was not what they had imagined, then what had this entire war truly been? Near the gate, an American officer spoke with one of his men. "No shouting," he instructed calmly. "No rough handling. They're exhausted." The women heard it. Even without understanding every word, they understood the tone. There was no hatred in it, and that frightened them more than anger ever could, because anger is easy to resist. Humanity is not. As the morning sun climbed higher, the camp no longer felt like a place of immediate fear. It felt like something else, a transition, not from prisoner to free, but from certainty to doubt. And doubt, in that moment, was far more powerful than hunger. The camp no longer felt frozen in fear, but it wasn't calm either. It was uncertain. By midday, the fog had burned away. The muddy yard looked harsher under direct sunlight. Reality always did. Some of the women had finished eating. Others sat quietly, holding empty mugs long after the coffee was gone, as if warmth might return if they waited. Then something unexpected happened. An American officer entered the yard carrying a small wooden crate. He spoke briefly with the guards. Then he turned toward the prisoners. A translator stepped forward. "You will be allowed," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully, "to write home." The reaction wasn't loud. It was still, as if the entire yard stopped breathing at once. "Right? Home?" One woman shook her head immediately. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." Another muttered, "They'll censor it." A third added, "They won't send it." The translator continued, "Paper will be provided. Letters will be inspected for military information, but they will be delivered." Delivered. That word hit harder than breakfast, because breakfast was survival. This was connection. A young woman near the fence stepped forward. "My mother believes I'm dead," she said, her voice unsteady. The translator hesitated, then repeated her words to the officer. The officer nodded once. "You can tell her you're alive." There was no sarcasm in his tone, no performance, just a statement. For months, many of these women had prepared themselves for disappearance, for being erased quietly at the end of a losing war. Instead, they were being handed paper. Pencils were passed out, rough, cheap sheets, but clean. Some women didn't move at first, because writing meant facing reality. What do you say? I am a prisoner. I am safe. The enemy fed me. Across one of the tables, a former nurse pressed the pencil to the paper and froze. Her hands had stitched wounds under artillery fire, but now they trembled over a blank page. "What if they don't believe me?" she whispered. Another replied softly, "Then we tell the truth anyway." A breeze moved through the yard. Pages fluttered. Slowly, words began to appear, short sentences at first. "I am alive. I am being treated well. Do not worry." An American soldier walked past one of the tables and noticed a woman staring at her paper, unable to write. He stopped. Carefully, without touching her, he set down an extra pencil. She looked up at him, confused. He nodded once and walked away. No speeches, no grand gestures, just small acts. And somehow, those small acts were dismantling something that had been built for years. Across the yard, one woman finally wrote a sentence she never thought she would. "The Americans gave us breakfast." She stared at it, then underlined it. Because it felt unreal, because it was. Not the breakfast itself, but what it represented. As afternoon shadows began to stretch across the camp, the women no longer looked like they had that morning. They still wore the same uniforms, still sat behind the same fences, but something inside them had shifted again. Fear had become doubt. Doubt was becoming awareness, and awareness was far more dangerous than hunger ever was. The letters were collected at sunset. No ceremony, no promises, just a wooden box carried back through the gate. That night, very few of the women slept. Some lay awake staring at the ceiling of the barracks, replaying every word they had written. Did I say too much? Did I say too little? Will it even arrive? Days passed. Routine began to settle in. Breakfasts continued. Medical checks, roll calls, silence. The uncertainty was harder than hunger had been. Then, one gray afternoon, the gate opened again. But this time the truck didn't carry food. It carried mail. At first, no one understood what was happening. The same translator stepped forward. There are responses. No one moved, because hope had become dangerous. The officer began reading names. The first woman, called, simply stood frozen. Others nudged her forward. She walked slowly, as if approaching something fragile. A single envelope, thin, worn, her name written in familiar handwriting. Her knees nearly gave out. She didn't open it immediately. She pressed it to her chest first, as if confirming it was real. Around her, the yard had gone silent again. Then more names were called. Not everyone received a letter. That hurt, but for those who did, the world shifted. The first woman finally broke the seal. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely unfold the paper. She scanned the first line, and then she covered her mouth. "She thought I was dead," she whispered. Tears came faster this time, not from hunger, not from fear, from relief. She read aloud in fragments. "We prayed for you. We heard nothing. Are you truly safe?" Safe. That word echoed strangely inside the camp. Another woman opened her letter and began shaking her head slowly. "My father writes that the city is gone," she said. "Bombed." The war outside had not softened. Homes were still falling, families still scattered. The breakfast had not ended the war, but it had changed something smaller, and perhaps more lasting. A young prisoner near the fence opened her envelope and found something unexpected inside. A photograph. Faded. Her little brother standing in front of what remained of their house. She stared at it for a long time, then she looked up toward the American guards. "They could have treated us differently," she said quietly. No one disagreed. Across the yard, one woman who had not received a letter sat alone. The girl who had taken the first bite days earlier noticed her. Without speaking, she tore a small piece of paper from her own letter and slid it across the table. "Read mine," she said softly. And so they did. Sharing news, sharing grief, sharing relief. Something else was forming now. Not loyalty, not admiration, but understanding. The enemy had faces, voices, fathers, brothers, just like theirs. As dusk settled over the camp, the mood was no longer confusion. It was complexity. The world had not become simple. It had become harder to divide, and that realization was heavier than any chain. The war was still ending in fire, but inside the fences, something quieter was happening. Something that would follow them long after they walked free. Not everyone received a letter, and not everyone was ready to forgive the silence. That evening, the barracks felt different. The women who had letters read them again and again under the dim bulbs hanging from exposed wires. Some folded them carefully beneath their pillows. Others memorized every line as if the paper might vanish overnight. But in the corner of the room sat Marta. She had not been called. Not on the first name, not on the second. Not at all. She hadn't cried in the yard. She hadn't reacted. But now, sitting on the edge of her bunk, staring at the wooden floorboards, her jaw tightened. "They forgot me," she said quietly. "No," someone replied gently. "It may still come." Marta shook her head. "You heard what she read," she said, nodding toward the woman with the photograph. "Cities gone, homes destroyed. Maybe there's nothing left to write from." Silence followed that. Because it was possible. The war outside was still burning through neighborhoods, through rail stations, through entire histories. Across the room, the girl who had taken the first bite stepped closer. She sat beside Marta. "You don't know yet," she said softly. Marta didn't look at her. "I was wrong about the Americans," she said flatly. maybe I'm wrong about everything. That was the real fracture, not hunger, not captivity, uncertainty. The next morning, routine continued. Breakfast was served again, and this time fewer hands trembled. But Marta did not approach the tables. She stood near the fence instead, staring through the wire at the open sky beyond the camp. An American soldier noticed. He had been present the first morning, one of the younger ones. He approached slowly, stopping several steps away. He didn't speak German well, but he tried. "No letter?" he asked carefully. Marta stiffened. She didn't answer at first. Then, without looking at him, she said, "No family." He didn't know if that meant none existed, or none remained. He nodded slowly. After a moment, he removed something from his jacket pocket, a small, folded photograph. He held it up, not handing it to her, just showing it. A woman and a little boy. "My home," he said simply. He tapped the image. "Miss?" The word hung awkwardly between them. Marta looked at the picture for only a second before looking away, but something in her expression shifted. Not softness, recognition. War had taken from him too. He returned the photo to his pocket. No speeches, no moral lessons. Just shared absence. Later that afternoon, another truck arrived. Mail again. The names were read, one by one. And then, Marta Keller. The room felt smaller instantly. She didn't move. The others turned toward her. Again, her name was called. Slowly, she stepped forward. The envelope was thinner than the others, lighter. Her hands shook as she opened it. Only one page inside. Short, brief. Her sister's handwriting. "We are alive. The house is damaged. Father is missing. But we are alive." Marta read the last line twice. "We are alive." She exhaled in a way that sounded almost like a laugh, or maybe a sob. She looked up, not at the guards, not at the fence, at the sky. For the first time since arriving, her shoulders lowered. Around her, the women watched quietly, not cheering, not speaking, just witnessing, because they all understood what that sentence meant. The war was not over, loss was not undone, but survival was enough for today. And in that camp, behind wire and watchtowers, survival had become something shared, not between enemies, between humans. It came without warning. No dramatic sirens, no sudden chaos, just a change in the air. The guards were quieter that morning, not tense, focused. Shortly after roll call, the American officer who had allowed the letters stepped into the yard again. This time, he carried a folded piece of paper. The women noticed immediately. Something was different. The translator joined him. The officer spoke briefly in English first, his voice steady, almost restrained. Then the translator turned toward the prisoners. "There has been a major development," he began carefully. The yard went silent. "German forces have formally surrendered in several sectors." The words didn't land all at once. They hovered, surrendered. Some of the women stared blankly. Others shook their heads as if mishearing. "No," someone whispered. "That can't be official." The translator continued. "The war in Europe is approaching its end." Approaching. Not ended, but close enough that the word after suddenly existed. After the war, after the uniforms, after the propaganda, after the fear. One woman began to cry quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, just a release that had been building for months. Another stood frozen. "If the war is ending," she said slowly, "what happens to us?" That question moved through the yard like wind. What happens to prisoners when there is no longer a war? Repatriation? Interrogation? Trial? Release? No one knew. The officer seemed to understand the unspoken panic. He spoke again, calmly. "You will remain here temporarily. You will continue to receive food and medical care. Further decisions will follow official agreements." It was measured, controlled, but it wasn't cruel. The women looked at one another. For years, they had been told that defeat would mean annihilation. Instead, defeat felt administrative, uncertain, bureaucratic, but not brutal. Near the fence, Marta folded her letter carefully and slipped it into her jacket. "My sister will know soon," she said softly. The girl who had taken the first bite stood beside her. "Do you think they will blame us?" she asked. "For what?" Marta replied. "For believing," she said. That was the heaviest sentence spoken that day, because belief had shaped everything, and now belief was dissolving. Across the yard, an American soldier leaned against a truck, listening to the announcement. He removed his helmet and ran a hand through his hair. Relief touched his face, too. The war had taken years from him, from all of them. One of the older women suddenly straightened her posture. "If it is ending," she said quietly, "then we must decide who we are after it." No one answered immediately, because they had worn identities for so long: soldier, auxiliary, loyal citizen, enemy. Now those words felt fragile. As the announcement ended, no one cheered. No one celebrated. Victory was not theirs, but survival was. And survival had begun with something small: a plate of eggs, a cup of coffee, a letter that said, "We are alive." The fences still stood. The guards still watched. But the air felt thinner now, lighter. For the first time since arriving, the women weren't thinking about the next meal. They were thinking about the next life. And that was far more frightening. The fences did not come down immediately. There were still procedures, lists, transfers, agreements signed somewhere far away in the rooms none of them would ever see. But something invisible had already fallen. The hostility, the certainty, the old definitions. In the days after the announcement, routine slowly shifted. The guards no longer carried the same sharp posture. Conversations, brief and careful, became more frequent. Not friendly, not familiar, just human. One morning, the women were instructed to gather their belongings. There wasn't much: a folded blanket, a tin cup, letters now worn soft at the edges from being read too often. The officer stood near the gate again, clipboard in hand. "You will be transferred in stages," the translator explained, "processing before return." Return. That word felt heavier than surrender. Return to what? Ruins? Silence? Questions from neighbors? Or simply empty spaces where life used to be? Marta stood near the front of the group. Her sister's letter rested inside her jacket. The girl who had taken the first bite stood beside her. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The gate opened. Not for trucks with food, not for announcements, for them. One by one, the women stepped forward. No one rushed. Some glanced back at the yard, the tables where breakfast had been served, the spot near the fence where letters were handed out, the place where surrender had been announced. Strange how quickly a place of fear had become a place of change. As Marta passed the American soldier who had once shown her the photograph of his family, their eyes met briefly. He didn't smile, he simply nodded. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded back. Not gratitude, not forgiveness, acknowledgement that they had both survived. Outside the gate, the world looked the same. Gray sky, damaged roads, uncertain horizon. But the women walking through it were not the same as the ones who had entered weeks before. They had expected cruelty. They had prepared for humiliation. Instead, they had encountered something more complicated: food, letters, restraint, humanity shown in small, controlled measures. The war had taken much from them, from everyone. It had built walls in minds long before barbed wire was ever strung across this camp. And yet, what remained was not rage. It was memory. The memory of a morning when steam rose from metal containers and someone said, "Breakfast." The memory of trembling hands holding a letter that began with, "We are alive." The memory of realizing that the world was not as simple as they had been taught. As the group moved down the road under light escort, no one spoke loudly. But one woman finally broke the silence. "What will you remember?" she asked quietly. Marta thought for a moment. Not the fence, she said. Not the guards. She looked ahead. I will remember the first bite. The camera of history would record battles, treaties, surrenders. But inside one muddy camp yard, something quieter had ended long before the war officially did. Fear had loosened its grip. Certainty had cracked. And in its place remained something far more difficult. Understanding.